Most X-Men fans may think of the classic 80s version when asked which animated show they remember. The intense storylines and vivid color palette make the 80s version unforgettable, but X-Men Evolution has a style all its own. Created by Marty Eisenberg, Robert Skur, and David Wise. I apologize if I mess up anyone's name during the pronunciation. This series was clearly inspired by one of the most popular superhero teams in the entire genre, and in my opinion, arguably, the most popular superhero team. That is definitely up for debate after Marvel's movie Mayhem. The X-Men, created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. X-Men Evolution will always hold a special place in my heart. This is my first deep dive, and when deciding what topic to cover, it seemed appropriate to do the show I started my channel with. The X-Men are my favorite superhero team ever. Well, if I'm being a little unbiased, if I'm being completely biased and obscure, I'm sure I could think of a couple I like more, but that's not important right now. The X-Men are important right now. But as I was saying, the X-Men are my favorite superhero team, and this show may play a large part into that. Making its debut November 4th, 2000. This reimagining of the X-Men sees most of its core members in high school, with the exception of Professor Charles Xavier, Wolverine, and Storm.
Oh, look, I don't want...
Silence! You'll do as you're told! Understand?
Beast and Angel join in later seasons. The series starts off with Scott and Jean already enrolled, while Kurt's getting recruited and Toad is being scouted. In the extremely short-lived X-Men Evolution comic, it takes the time to flesh out Charles, Ororo, who's I'm going to probably alternate calling Storm and Ororo because I like saying them both, but I'll try to stick with Ororo, Logan, Scott, and Jean's origin stories. Ororo has a moment where she powers Cerebro, which it was very cool seeing her charge it with her lightning manipulation abilities, since Charles needed a bigger source of power, and it just made them instantly bond. Something that would have been quite nice to see in the show. And Jean's origin was particularly interesting. It even hints at Logan's affection for her. A big plot point in the comics, but something not seen in the show since Jean is in high school and Logan's literally over 100 or something. But most people forget that. They're just like, oh, he's really old. But he looks like 40, so whatever. During this deep dive in retrospective, we will be comparing moments from the comics that parallel moments from the show as they become relevant, but the comics can stand alone. They are their own path and story, and at some points you have to have watched the show to understand what's happening in the comics. There's a giant time jump that basically from season 1 to season 2, all of these new characters just appear and it's just happening. You just kind of go with it. But it didn't really faze me because I had watched the show. Before we dig into each episode independently, we're going to talk about the characters, starting with the leading lineup and 2 minor characters that make a significant impact but do not have a leading place. Starting with Scott Summers, the field leader of the X-Men.
Cyclops.
Come on, Professor, I'm packing a bazooka behind each eyeball. What do you want from me?
Control, Scott.
Very much reflecting his comic persona, Cyclops can be considered the Boy Scout. Beginning as the altruistic leader and turning into an instructor at the Institute, Scott, I'd say, grew the least, but mostly because he's an example to the new and younger students. But even he has his moments. He is still a teenage boy after all. Throughout the series, he reunites with his long-lost brother, finds the courage to tell Jean about his feelings, and proves he is most capable to lead the X-Men. Something that is actually fleshed out with more detail in the comics and would have been a welcome inclusion in the show.
Jean Grey.
I can hold it off a little.
Why doesn't she get a code name? Because the name Marvel Girl is lame, and they can't call her Phoenix when she could barely lift her own body weight. Jean Grey is a model student, honor roll. She participates in multiple extracurriculars. She's well-liked and a joy to be around in general. She steps into the leader role multiple times in this series, which is refreshing, and proving she's definitely no damsel in distress. No woman in this house is. We get to see Jean's power slowly develop over the course of the show, as well as her love triangle with Scott and Duncan. And I do the air quotes because like it's just ridiculous to even have her have a love interest if Scott's gonna be in the show. But it was fun. It's kind of hot. I'm gonna take this off. It's gonna be a long one. Kurt Wagner, better known as Nightcrawler.
Got a special gift that brought you here?
Maybe.
In my opinion, Kurt is the most complex character in the leading cast next to Rogue. Born a mutant to Mystique and experimented on by Magneto, where it is implied Kurt got his demonic appearance.
Monster! What have you done to him?
Kurt is the first student to join the Institute on screen. To help Kurt blend in with the general populace, the professor creates the Holowatch, giving him the appearance of a German teenage boy. The Watch becomes a key point in Kurt's development and even gets an interesting arc in the comics that I also wish they would have put in the show. The comic may have happened later, I don't know, but it had a lot of interesting ideas that it felt like the show wish it could have just put into it. Some of it was like just kind of off the wall, and there was an issue that was very standalone, but we'll get into that later. In the comics, Kurt begins keeping his Holowatch's projection on at the Institute when he's training, studying, just being there in general. He becomes so comfortable, or perhaps addicted would be more accurate, that he begins wearing it in his sleep. Granted, this did happen after he had a nightmare, and that triggered him. It was a nightmare about the Holowatch. And in this nightmare, he was at school and the watch glitched and people saw his true form and it was a big fiasco. And after that, he turned it on when he went back to sleep. Kurt comes off as goofy and nonchalant, but when things get serious, so does he. A wonderful character.
I don't believe it! I'm normal.
Of course you're normal, Kurt, but not because of that machine.
Normal is what you truly are. Never think otherwise.
Next, we have
Rogue.
My power is your power, and I can take more than one.
I believe her real name is Anna Marie, but we don't get that. Ditching her Southern Belle roots for a more detached gothic persona, this is easily my favorite rendition of the character. Not to stereotype styles, but this is a 2000 show. Gothic styles can give off an unapproachable vibe. Spikes, leather, heavily covered, dark colors, less approachable than other maybe preppy styles, more revealing and such. Something perfect for a girl who literally drains your life force with a touch. This version of Rogue plays into her comic origins in a unique way. Initially, she was a member of the Brotherhood. During this time, she touched Carol Danvers, known at the time as Miss Marvel, for too long and rendered her comatose. This caused Rogue to permanently absorb Carol's powers and abilities and a part of her heroic psyche, which eventually led to her joining the X-Men, not only because of the heroic nature that she absorbed, but for the professor to help her with the personality. In this version, Rogue is stubborn, standoffish, and slow to trust people. But at the end of the day, if you're on her team, she's got your back.
Whoa. That was like pretty icksome. Am I talking like her?
Next, we have Kitty Pryde, better known as
Shadowcat.
Right, I'm so sure.
They call her Kitty more in this series, but I love calling her Shadowcat. We're gonna call her Kitty most of the time though. Kitty is interesting because she was basically the only character in the leading cast that was already the appropriate age in her comic origins for this project. Debuting as Sprite, I believe, maybe it's Ariel, and then going through numerous codenames before ending up on, in my opinion, one of the coolest and most unique superhero names in the entire genre, Shadowcat. It literally plays to her actual name, Catherine, Kitty, Cat, Shadowcat, and feels strangely appropriate for a girl who could walk through walls. She begins as the reluctant Valley Girl hero who quickly becomes one of the most valuable members of the team. In the comics, when Scott is asked to be field leader, he's reluctant knowing that Jean and Kitty are around because he sees them as highly capable, if not more so, than him. Kitty can often be a refreshing point of view since she mostly wants to do what teenagers do. Date, shop, party, and not embarrass themselves doing it.
Lousy ride, loser.
Completing our leading cast, we have, I believe, the only original character in this series, and I mean completely original. They were made head to toe for this show. Evan Daniels, better known as
Spyke.
Why don't you stick around for a while?
Evan's power is almost identical to the Morlock Marrow, who was conveniently left out of the Morlocks episode. The only difference coming later when Evan's mutation evolves, as far as I know. I don't know about Marrow too much, just probably look that up. And some might say it's a secondary mutation, it's so different. But allowing him to heat up the spikes and encase his body in armor. Being so similar to Marrow, it felt so appropriate for Evan to eventually leave the X-Men to lead the Morlocks.
Been expecting you. You gotta be sharp if you're gonna mess with the Spyke.
Next, we have instructors and leaders, starting with Professor Charles Xavier, known as Professor X, the founding member of the X-Men and formerly best friends with Magneto. Charles is portrayed a bit differently than I'm used to. His ethics on telepathic influence are grayish. Upon a second rewatch, and scripting, I'd say it's not as bad as I initially thought when I wrote this, but it's still very skewed. Maybe not gray, but it's skewed. It's definitely not straightforward. I won't do it without your permission. It's circumstance. Example, in the comics, Charles forces a nurse to bid Scott farewell after dealing with an accident that left a hospital building damaged. Very similar to the incident in Blind Alley that we'll get into much later in the video. Nothing too out of the ordinary, but still a bit unethical for the man who so proudly claims he will never read another person's thoughts without their permission. His portrayal as the mentor and sometimes father figure is a welcome and much needed presence in the show. And his time as a horseman of apocalypse was iconic and unforgettable, and we will be getting into that much later in the video. Next, we have Ororo Munroe, better known as Storm.
All right then. It's time you remembered why they call me Storm.
And if you're one of my fans, then you know that she's been on 2 of my top 10 lists, and she is the winner of 1. You have to watch them to see which. I'll link them below. Ororo changes very little throughout the series since we're dealing with an older, very experienced Storm, but that doesn't make her presence any less impactful. She's a guiding light for most of the first generation students. And the show and comics wonderfully display her claustrophobia. She was also iconic as a horseman of apocalypse. Next, we have probably the most famous X-Men ever, Mr. Logan, better known as Wolverine, a much more tame version of his comic counterpart. Logan acts as the tough teacher with a mysterious background. Out of all of the instructors, I'd say he changes the least, but that definitely seems fitting. He is over 100 years old. His role allows him to get emotionally closer to the students that have a difficult time letting people in, like Evan and Rogue. Closing out the instructors for the Institute, we have Dr. Hank McCoy, who is much better known as Beast. Hank receives a great amount of development fairly quickly. We meet him as an instructor at Bayville. Sometimes I'm going to be like this because I want to show that off. And he decides to teach the second generation students at the Institute instead of getting a hollow watch like her and continuing his life at Bayville. Next, we have 2 leaders, starting with Magneto. A presence initially looming in the shadows until making his move towards mutant evolution. Magneto does very little and the most all at once. A powerful antagonist to the X-Men. This defender of mutant kind will do whatever it takes to keep his people one step ahead, even teaming up with the enemy if necessary. Next, we have Mystique. Real name, as far as everyone knows, it could be something else, but she is most commonly known as Raven Darkholm, which is the name she uses as the principal at Bayville High.
I have much to teach you, my young Avalanche.
A founding member of the Brotherhood, Mystique is chaos at its finest. Her power allows her to get close to almost anyone and be undetectable, giving her ample opportunities to sway things in her favor. There are moments that humanize Mystique and make her feel like more than a villain, but I'd say she is easily the most selfish in the cast.
Yes, I did do it.
And now things are about to get much worse.
Continuing with notable characters, we have the Brotherhood, and we're going to start with Lance, better known as Avalanche.
All right!
And this is the only incarnation of Avalanche that I enjoy, and I think I ever really see. I don't see them very much unless they're like meant to go out in like one hit by a background X-Man, or just to like fill out room on the page or in the background. Like I never see them use Lance like he was used in this show. And it's so much fun to see him interact with Kitty, his struggle with good and bad. Lance is a cool character, and we're going to talk about him a lot. Out of the Brotherhood, easily the most interesting with the mountain of depths. Lance is their unofficial field leader for most of the show. Initially a fully devoted member, but his path begins to waver as his feelings for Kitty grow stronger, even facing Magneto powered up by Apocalypse to save her. Todd Tolanski, better known and mostly known as T-O-A-D. He's another one of those where people started just calling him his mutant name and they forget his name is Todd. He gets extended a hand of friendship by the Professor upon his first encounter, but Toad wasn't convinced and decided to join the Brotherhood pretty easily. In the comics, his origins treated a lot more sensitively and very much humanizes him. It was the first instance I wasn't just disgusted with the character. I think he's meant to do that, but I felt very bad for him. And I wish, once again, this was another piece added to the show. And now that I'm thinking about it, maybe that's what the comic was supposed to do. Maybe it was just supposed to fill in some blanks that they wish they could have done in the show. So I highly recommend reading it for people who wish to check out the show. In the comics, Toad just wants to fit in, and he tries to with a group of guys playing basketball. Knowing his mutant abilities would impress the crowd, he shows off. And of course, he's only ostracized. Soon after, he forces a bus to run off course just out of spite and anger, which Scott is able to save, thankfully. There's a point where he's pinned under some kind of debris, and Jean and Scott are forced to help him out, and unintentionally Jean hears his thoughts, and it's just very sad and raw and real, and you can't help but feel bad for him. I thought this did a beautiful job humanizing Toad and showcased well how less aesthetically pleasing mutants are treated. Next, we have Fred Dukes, better known as Blob. He's about as plain as they come. He starts off selfish and dense in the head, and that's where he leaves the series. We can move on. Next, we have Pietro Maximoff, better known as Quicksilver, Magneto's son, and another complex member amongst the Brotherhood. Pietro starts off as a rival to Evan, and then as he joins the Brotherhood, he finds himself switching allegiances to Magneto. So he like flips both sides, only on the villains team, which I find interesting since Lance kind of flips both sides with the heroes and villains, but never Magneto. Next, we have the Scarlet Witch.
Uh-oh. Bad vibe.
Perhaps the most tragic character in the series.
Hey, watch it. Watch her.
Not a competition. Wanda is the daughter of Magneto and the twin sister of Pietro, wielding enormous power that is never fully explained, but she demonstrates the ability to use other mutants' powers against them and stop a mutant from using their powers altogether, like a Ty Lee effect, and cause just general mayhem and unfortune. She has an interesting, not completely explained power. Locked away as a child due to her immense uncontrollable abilities, when released by Mystique, Wanda single-handedly defeated the X-Men, and I'd say with ease. Some notable side characters we'll be talking about throughout the series are Warren Worthington, say that 5 times fast, better known as Angel, and one of the first X-Men ever made of the first 5. Angel gets a decent amount of screen time, and he even gets a spotlight episode when the X-Men Evolution version of the First Class X-Men all team up, and it's a very nice shout out.
Oh yeah, definitely the cool team.
We'll talk about the episode when it comes up. Alex Masters, who changes his name back to Alex Summers, his long-lost brother that he thought was dead. His storylines will tug at your heartstrings. They're definitely few, but potent. Jubilation Lee, better known as Jubilee. Her story is unfortunately short-lived due to story-relevant reasons, and she ends up departing the Institute. Bobby Drake, better known as Iceman.
Wow.
He almost steps into the place of Evan later in the series and gets quite a bit of screen time. Danny Moonstar, who only appears for one episode, but it's one of the most creative episodes in the show. Remy LeBeau, better known as Gambit, one of the coolest X-Men. Gambit comes in suave with an unforgettable design. Amara, who is eventually known as Magma, but I don't think they ever call her that in the series. But Amara gets a lot of shine, and she has a very special episode at the end for Cruise Control. It's like an epilogue, but it centers around her power growth arc reaching its climax for the show, and it's a wonderful episode.
Oh man, how cool are you?
Tabitha, known by Mystique as Bam Bam, but better known as Boom Boom. She's annoying though. I don't like Tabitha. She's a good character, but I don't like her. She's a shining example of what it's like to use your powers with no regard for others. There's a lot more characters, but I'd say those definitely stand out. And we're still going to talk about everyone anyway. So before we get into that, let's talk about the general designs really quick. Clearly a product of its time with oversized pants and general 2000s aesthetic. Most of the main cast leaves a bit to be desired in their daily outfits and costumes. Or as Logan would correct you and say, a uniform. He only did that in the comic, but it was great. Rogue and Kitty stand out, and I admire that their new looks play homage to their old classic team outfits, but the new looks are forgettable. I blame the X-Men movies' popularity for that. Something I very much enjoyed though was how often the characters dressed for the occasion. We get camping outfits, school dance look, winter wardrobes, and more. It's very refreshing and nice. We applaud the animators for that. The characters even upgrade their standard designs later, so there's definitely a lot of effort being put into the new unique designs, but like I said, it just comes off a bit bland, not too unique, but it's good enough, and it definitely plays into their personalities, which is all it really needs to do. Let's begin with season 1, and let me just say I've rewatched this show twice. It's 55 episodes when I thought it was 43 for some reason. I don't know why I thought that. And it's not 55 episodes. It's this episode's amount on the screen. I'm sorry I said that. But I rewatched it twice. It took me 3 days to script this. This is a novella. My script is a novella, and I put a lot of effort into this. I just hope you enjoy it, and I just wanted you to know that a lot has gone on in the background just to collect this information. But I gathered most of it from just watching, getting it from the show myself, and things that I just know. So let's get into episode 1, titled Strategy X. I want to start off with a bit of a synopsis for the season, actually, before we get into Strategy X. And I've been reacting to She-Ra on my channel. I will finish it eventually, I promise, but go check that out if you like. She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, the Netflix adaptation, reminds me of this show a lot. Like a modern generation, rainbow aesthetically themed version. Both are aimed at kids, but have extremely mature lessons and themes.
You inspired us. You inspired me. Not because it was your destiny, but because you never let fear stop you. And now, I choose to be brave.
No! Your Majesty! Angela!
That was so beautiful. I don't even think the characters make goofy faces in this. Like, they may do a goofy expression, but not like anime where it's like an exaggerated, out of style expression. The art style is sleek and serious, but of course it has its humorous moments. Something I think both shows do very well is showing people, X-Men specifically, is showing the characters using their powers in everyday life. Like, we see them playing sports, or like Shadowcat just needs to get an apple at a point or something that leads to her phasing through a table, but stuff that's not action based, where it's just something that if someone had those powers, they would apply to the everyday routine that they have. And it's very organic, and it shows how much thought has been put into the characters' lives. So with Strategy X, we start with the recruitment of Kurt and the refusal of Toad. So since I actually did cover Strategy X pretty thoroughly, doing the comic comparison for Toad's origin story, because both are basically Toad's origin story and Kurt's recruitment, we are going to go to the next episode, The X Impulse.
Discovery, mutant signature. Extrapolation, complete. Identity confirmed. Name, Kitty Pryde.
Oh my gosh, can you hear the plane? Kitty is discovered soon after Kurt's recruitment, after her powers manifest during her sleep, causing her to phase into her basement, and in her nightmare, she thought she was flying and then suddenly she was falling, to parallel what actually happened to her in-world experience. She gets bullied by stereotypical popular girls and finds comfort in Lance, who reveals that he is also a mutant to her. Charles picks Jean to accompany him and as his best chance to recruit Kitty, since Jean and Kitty have a similar social standing in their high school lives. They don't succeed and Kitty ends up helping Lance steal test answers. Unbeknownst to her, he did trick her. Eventually, the two get cornered and Lance decides to bring down the building. Jean is able to protect herself and Kitty's parents from the rubble by using her telekinesis to divert it away. And to get through to Kitty, she says a quote that still echoes through my mind sometimes to this day.
You called your gift a curse. If you go with him, I guarantee you it will be. Please, Kitty, listen to her!
Sweetheart, we love you!
This, along with her parents' pleas, gets through to Kitty, and with a new grasp on her powers, she uses them to phase herself and the rest of the group out of the collapsing building to safety. Convinced the Institute is the best place for her, she decides to join the X-Men.
These people, they want to help me. I trust them.
I know, sweetie. And so do I.
The next episode is titled Rogue Recruit.
Too much power! I can't control it! I have to...
Pretty straightforward. Rogue gets noticed by Cerebro next when her powers activate at a party, I believe, when she gets too close to a boy that she just happens to be dancing with. Mystique and Destiny, who become her foster mothers, true to the comics, begin to take action when Destiny has a vision of the X-Men's interest in Rogue. Fun fact, in the comics, I mean Marvel comics, not the Evolution version, Mystique and Destiny are a couple. And I think they're a very fascinating couple considering the nature of their powers and who they are. After Rogue's powers cause the boy she touched at the party to go into a coma, Mystique begins to manipulate her into thinking the X-Men are her enemy by changing into them and attacking her, while simultaneously guiding her to the Brotherhood. In the end, Rogue decides to join the X-Men, but she didn't forget about the communicator Jean gave her. Or she did, because this plot point is completely forgotten, but still a fun ending.
Latest fashion accessory, huh?
Episode 4 is titled Mutant Crush. Next to be detected by Cerebro is Blob. And I think this is a good time to give my overall thoughts on this version of Cerebro. Also, another fun fact, when Cerebro got destroyed, Cerebro gets destroyed a lot, but one of the times Cerebro got destroyed, Emma Frost rebuilt it and named it Cerebra. So I love the way Cerebro functions in this show. I know it's easy to argue anything in superhero culture can be overpowered, but I always thought Charles being able to locate any person at any point in the world at any time was a little OP. Like how the X-Men do it in the movies. In X-Men Evolution, however, a mutant must be using their powers actively to be located by Cerebro. Which begs a few small questions, like how would it detect someone like Beast? Is he always detectable? Or does he have to be doing something acrobatic? What about Angel? Is it when he moves his wings ever? Is it only when he's flying? Or is he always detectable? What is the criteria for that? They never go into the depth of it that much, but I'm curious. And that would have been nice to see expanded upon if we got later and more mature versions for this incarnation of the X-Men. Because of the way Cerebro works in this world, this led to a bunch of intense and very unique and fun scenarios where characters end up stranded and need to use creative ways to be located or rescued. It also helps give a more realistic approach to how Charles always locates people when their power manifests, because if he's just constantly searching on the grid and it only detects once a power is fluxing, that's what he will notice. I bet he spends a lot of time just monitoring the astral ethos, waiting for a flux And that's when he pinpoints onto a mutant's new emergence. Back to the episode. Blob is discovered putting on a show using his mutation by Jean and Logan. And I think I should start off by saying he has one of the creepiest episodes in the series, and this is the 4th one. Also, another fun fact, this is the first episode of anything I ever reacted to on the channel. It's unlisted now because that is really, really badly put together, but maybe I'll like redo it, or maybe I'll even make it public again if people really want to see it. Oh my gosh. It's not even one, it's in 3 pieces because I didn't really understand how YouTube worked at the time. Anyways, after being convinced by Mystique to enroll at Bayville and to at least get involved with her Brotherhood, Blob has a difficult time adjusting to student life.
Fill her up!
Jean is able to get through to him using her kindness and demonstrating her powers. After a food fight, she used her telekinesis to shatter a chair. And this always struck me as odd because Fred cheers her on only for her to declare,
"That's what we learn not to do."
And if she didn't want that, why would she like demonstrate her power in such a violent way? She could have just levitated the chair and put it back down peacefully. That would have shown control. Maybe if I'm reaching, maybe she knew he was into that like violence and stuff because he clearly has anger problems and he likes to destroy things, so she was using that to like make a middle ground. I don't know. I'm reaching. Later, he decides to kidnap Jean.
I have responsibilities, and that means I can't go with you right now.
But you're my friend.
And after getting tracked down by Scott and Logan, Blob easily defeats them, leaving Rogue to rescue Jean, who is still not quite for the X-Men, but still very neutral to the whole situation.
Leave her alone, you yahoo!
What you gonna do to me?
My power is your power, and I can take more than one!
Now, the reason why she saved Jean may have been because of the communicator. It was never explicitly stated, and maybe that's where they wanted us to go with that plot point, and that's what I like to think of it as. At least after this retrospective, because they never really bring it up and they don't specifically say why Rogue helped, but Jean did show extreme kindness and they had that connection with the communicator, so maybe that's why Rogue even showed up to help her in the first place.
You can't hurt me! I'm the Blob!
Nah, you're just garbage that wanted a date. Now tell you what, I'm taking you out!
Episode 5 is titled Speed and Spyke, and here we follow Ororo in New York attending a basketball game starring Evan. Pietro is also on this team, and after getting knocked down fairly hard, Evan's mutation activates and his forearm sprouts spikes, cleaving the floor. Ororo notices that something might be off with Pietro during the game as well, before confronting Evan about his little incident. After displaying further lack of control in the locker room in front of Ororo, she arranges a meeting with him and the professor so he could join the Institute alongside Jean and Scott. It's actually his parents. The professor hasn't come yet. Evan refuses his invitation to the Institute and goes back to his high school in order to set up a trap for someone who's been consistently stealing money from him. And we quickly learn that it's Pietro, but Evan doesn't know this yet. When all of this goes south and Evan ends up locked up, he promises to give the Institute a try, and Charles uses his influence to get Evan's release. This leads to Evan joining Bayville's basketball team, and with Mystique being the principal, she orchestrates a basketball match at the last minute with Evan and his former team that has Pietro still. Evan ends up confronting Pietro and gets him to admit that he was the one that trashed the lockers that Evan got in trouble for. He teams up with Jean and Scott to get Pietro pinned to a wall after showing that he has tape recorded the whole conversation, and then he ends up liking the Institute and stays with the X-Men, while Pietro ends up joining the Brotherhood after Magneto releases him from prison. And they do hint towards their unique relationship, but very subtly.
It would appear your nephew's going to fit in just fine, Ororo.
But one must wonder, is that a good thing?
Episode 6 is titled Middleverse. With our team almost complete, it's always the angsty dark ones that join last, typically after being a villain for a while. But with our team almost complete, we get a Nightcrawler-centered episode. Scott and Kurt begin to butt heads due to Scott's serious demeanor and Kurt's laid-back attitude. Upset, Kurt teleports away in a fury. He discovers a long-lost lab by a super genius known as Forge, ends up tripping a trap, and destroys the whole thing. Rogue witnesses and finds a device that's unaffected by the explosion. Kurt attempts to take it away from her, and in their struggle, they activate it, and Kurt is teleported into a Middleverse. basically an alternate dimension, or a pocket dimension. This is a nice foreshadow to how Kurt's powers work and will be expanded upon later in the series, also with the help of Forge. Once the team discovers this, they battle the Brotherhood over ownership of the device and ultimately succeed.
Shadowcat down!
Using a makeshift trick to get Kurt back to reality for a split second, he's able to warn them not to destroy the device but to reset it, and after this is done, he is able to return to our dimension with Forge, who has also stopped aging in time in that pocket dimension, which I think is fascinating and something they could have expanded upon more if given the chance to really blow up the series, like a hyperbolic time chamber scenario or something. In the end, Scott learns to loosen up and Kurt learns to take things more seriously when the times are needed.
Okay, so now what do you say we head home, gear up, and run a level 3 training sim in the danger room?
Always serious.
Psych!
You got it!
Episode 7 is titled Turn of the Rogue. We next find our squad in a training simulation in the danger room where Rogue is centered as the enemy. This greatly affects Scott, and he confides in Jean at school. Little did he know Mystique was present and takes the opportunity to tell Rogue. Using her influence as principal and whatever other influence she has, she gets Jean kicked off of a field trip that she seemed to be pretty excited to be going on in favor of getting Rogue to go. After several dangerous shenanigans, we learn that Mystique has been on the trip the entire time, taking the place of Paul, Scott's sometimes friend, during like season 1 only. They talk like twice.
Hello, Scott. Are you more surprised to see me or me?
Principal Dark, you're Mystique?
Fed up with the games, Rogue grabs Mystique's hand and finds out the truth, absorbing her memories and powers. I love it when Rogue says it.
Your powers are mine. Your memories are mine.
Unable to accept defeat, Mystique begins to viciously attack them, first throwing a boulder at them and then transforming into a wolf and stalking them down the mountain. This leads to a wonderful moment and a very tense moment where the instructors find out that Scott is in danger, but they can't locate his exact spot because he needs to be using his powers for Cerebro to help. He does, however, shoot his optic blast straight into the air to simulate a flare that the instructors are able to locate. Rogue and Scott get rescued, and with the truth out in the open, and after bonding with Scott, Rogue decides to officially join the X-Men, completing our leading roster.
Welcome to the X-Men.
Episode 8, Spyke Cam? Rogue becomes roommates with Kitty, and the two don't exactly hit it off.
Here you go.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason. Ugh.
We learn that their school is performing the play Dracula, and Kitty wants to audition in order to get closer to a boy she likes. Something that I literally did in high school. It worked, and I was good at it anyways. Well, Rogue claims she's auditioning because
I was made for this play.
but I think it's just because she wants to jade Kitty. Evan ends up getting a special assignment that requires him to film. He begins filming everything in sight, including the mansion. Seems kind of dumb when you're a species that's not even public to society. I just wouldn't even film the stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like, just not, don't even have it recorded. Sabretooth acquires the tape and finds out that Logan has been staying at the mansion. This leads to a laughable confrontation where Sabretooth really comes up trying to stop everyone and is clearly no match for even several of them.
No! This is not the place for your private war!
But basically gets the message clear that he's out to get them. This puts the campus on red alert under Wolverine's orders. Evan decides to take matters into his own hands and convinces Kitty and Rogue to follow him into the woods to acquire dance footage for his project. While they're riding, you can tell by Kitty's posture that she's doing her best to avoid touching Rogue. A nice detail.
3 little piggies all alone. Logan, you're making this too easy.
Sabretooth ends up finding the trio, and Evan's plan is set in motion. He gets caught first, but spikes up every inch of his body, making Sabretooth unable to hold on to him. It's at this moment you may realize that each person there, in their own way, cannot be touched. Sabretooth rushes Kitty only to fall face first because she phases through him. But as she was temporarily distracted by Rogue recovering, she's struck by Sabretooth so hard that she flies into a tree and is rendered unconscious. With 2 down, Sabretooth goes after Rogue and ends up grabbing her in a way that he doesn't touch her skin, unfortunately for her. But fortunately, Logan shows up and the two begin to wrestle until Rogue gets a chance to touch him and end him. And when she touches Sabretooth, she ends up becoming a furry form. And I loved her hair as a kid. I remember thinking, like, when she transformed, that she should just, like, shave Sabretooth's hair and keep her hair long. But it probably just reverted. I don't know what happened, but I used to think that because she said,
and I just shaved my legs last night.
So it made me think she'd have to shave again. Seeing Rogue use other abilities is already awesome, but seeing her develop her victims' attributes, especially the ones due to their mutation like we just saw with Sabretooth, or even speaking German like Kurt, is so much fun. I absolutely live for those moments. She touches Hank later in the series Beast and doesn't get furry. Now, I'm sure it was probably because they didn't want to, like, animate her in that fashion. It was a lot easier to not have that happen. But, oh my gosh, this just came to me right now. Perhaps she just got his mutation factor, because Hank was just, like, kind of misproportioned and super strong and stuff. Like, that was his mutation. And then the chemicals that he did to try to cure himself put him into the beast form. Now, for all we know, his mutation would have just evolved that way, but it was scientific interference. So maybe she didn't transform because it was scientific interference and not just his mutation's general evolution. What do you think? Comment below. To sum this episode up, we get another strange situation of ethics involving telepathy with the professor, where Sabretooth is dropped off, we assume in the Antarctic. It's somewhere frozen in like a desert of ice. And this is after having his mind wiped. How much of his mind was wiped? We're not sure. Maybe it was just his knowledge of the Institute. I don't know. But his mind was definitely probed and wiped against his will. I get that the professor did that for the safety of the students. I probably would have too. But the Antarctic? I mean, if you made him forget, and I'm pretty sure with his healing factor, he won't freeze. But I'll have to look into that because the professor is secretly savage.
That's what being a family's all about. Hanging tight through the good times and bad. And these guys always hang tight.
Episode 9 is titled Survival of the Fittest. We pick up with the cast alongside the Brotherhood at summer camp. The X-Men must compete against their frequent antagonists by participating and winning the camp activities without using their powers, while the Brotherhood have little to no qualms about using theirs. Meanwhile, Mystique wakes up and releases Kane Marco, the Professor's brother and better known as the Unstoppable Juggernaut. After the X-Men go through a series of shenanigans involving their powers, being forced to use them, using them to cheat, alongside the Brotherhood, the two teams end up tying at the flag just in time for Ororo to appear and warn them that Mystique and the Professor are in danger of Juggernaut.
Up to it? Let's go!
Wolverine gets his ass handed to him, and after blowing off Mystique's deal with him, Juggernaut decides to eliminate her and the Professor, only to be subdued by the X-Men and the Brotherhood working together. This episode was one of the best in the first season, and thinking about this during the retrospective, it's one of the best in the series. Everyone gets a moment to shine, there's a lesson on the ethics of powers, and just competing with honor in general, and putting your differences aside to stop a threat bigger than you. A foreshadow on how this series will end.
You're only half bad. Well, then next time you can call the shots. Trust me, there won't be a next time.
Episode 10 is titled Shadowed Pass. After our very short-lived heroes and villains team up, Rogue is tormented by a nightmare of Mystique performing an experiment on a Kurt when he was only a baby. And this was implied to be under Magneto's order. The reason she's having the nightmare is an after effect of touching Mystique. Another foreshadow signaling the personalities Rogue absorbs have lingering effects. Charles confronts Mystique and uses his telepathy to locate the castle that Rogue saw inside of her dream. Another time where I question the ethics of his power. Does it not apply if it's a villain? Or if it's something that is for altruistic agenda? Where is his line? Wolverine investigates the castle and doesn't find much, while Mystique arranges a secret meeting with Kurt. Planning to tell him the truth, or at least some part of the truth, she reveals herself to him as his mother, only to be cut off by the Brotherhood under Magneto's orders. This moment really highlights the complexity of Mystique. This whole time she has allowed her team to battle the X-Men, knowing that her child is on the other end, children, but still wanting to connect with him does something I'd consider out of her character and allows herself to be vulnerable, even willing to reveal at least part of her true intentions. This is also something we'll see her continue to struggle with throughout the series, with Rogue and Kurt. Mystique is forced to flee and Kurt is left without many answers. In the end, it shows Mystique as Principal Darkholm gazing out of her window at a daughter wishing her mother farewell after getting dropped off. She bows her head, giving off a somber atmosphere, as we're left to wonder with her what life could have been like if things were different. Episode 11 is titled Grim Reminder. Later we get a spotlight episode for Kitty featuring Kurt and Logan. We follow her as she journals her chronicles at the Institute. During her quest for privacy, she finds her way to the X-Jet. Kurt finds her and the two are suddenly whisked away by Wolverine, who isn't aware that they're on board. Battling a mind control chip in his brain, Wolverine does his best to keep the two safe.
Can you transport us to the ground?
Yeah, right. Like, picture this. Bumpity, 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 splat! Too high up and way too fast.
But succumbs and ends up teaming up with Sabretooth to capture Kitty and Kurt. Being practically untouchable mutants, they easily avoid the Ravenous pair. And eventually, Kitty uses her sincerity to reach Logan long enough to help him gain control over the chip. A very sweet moment in the series that highlights the relationship in the comics.
It's me! Kitty! You're fighting it! You can win! Do you really want to hurt me, Mr. Logan?
Wolverine and Shadowcat are extremely close. He even trained her. They blow up the lab operating the mind control chip and return home. Apparently, they surgically remove the mind control chip, which I find problematic for two reasons. First, how did they perform the surgery with his healing factor? Second, why didn't Kitty just phase it out? And a third that I just thought off the top of my head, how did they get through his adamantium skull? Now, Kitty may not be experienced enough to get the chip, so I can believe that. But later in the show, we do understand that she can do this, and she runs through Hank and accidentally leaves her toothbrush inside of him, and then she runs back and easily takes it out. She didn't even have to see where it was. She just knew where it was, reached for it, and grabbed it out, and he seemed to be fine. So she can do this, just maybe that was later at the series when she was much better. So perhaps she's just not that good yet. The episode ends on a positive entry into Kitty's journal, and it's very sweet.
But I think I'd miss bumping into everyone. It's just part of the deal when you're a part of a family.
Season 1 finale, episodes 12 and 13. The Cauldron. So, fans of the comics, and especially Bay Scott Summers, might remember he has a younger brother, Alex Masters, who will eventually go by Havoc. He makes his debut after Cerebro detects the first use of his powers. Charles gathers Logan and Scott, and the trio head to Hawaii to reunite the long-lost brothers. Unbeknownst to them, Magneto has already taken an interest in this young, promising mutant. Elsewhere, Jean is ambushed by Toad and effortlessly defeats him. It's pretty embarrassing, even for Toad. In her victory, she is snatched up by a giant metal sphere and taken to an unknown location. Elsewhere, Kurt, Evan, Rogue, and Kitty planned on backseating to Hawaii with the others, but after getting left behind, decide to go to the beach. This leads to Ororo discovering the mansion empty, where she is ambushed by Mystique. Ororo and Mystique battle, and Mystique is effortlessly defeated. What were Toad and Mystique thinking? Mystique, I can see thinking too highly of her skills and mismatching an opponent. Okay. And perhaps the same is said for Todd in the opposite aspect. The 4 X-Men are ambushed by the Brotherhood and surprisingly get defeated, with the exception of Rogue, who beats Toad, who got defeated twice. Logan gets dropped off on a private island where Sabretooth waits to battle him one-on-one, while Scott takes the time to reconnect with Alex. Magneto introduces himself after kidnapping Charles and still persuades Scott to join him with Alex on Asteroid M. When Scott realizes half of his teammates have been abducted and subdued, he lashes out. But convinced by his brother, the two agree to go through a device that's said to complete your mutation. In the midst of this, the remaining X-Men arrive with the remaining Brotherhood to free the captured and stop Magneto's plans.
Knock, knock.
Mystique, you never could take no for an answer.
Scott and Alex emerge from the machine basically new people, and with the asteroid quickly collapsing, everyone begins evacuating. except Mystique and Magneto, who are still in the Enhancer. Once Jean and Charles fail to reach the brothers, they're forced to leave them behind. The asteroid then explodes and threatens to take everyone with it. In one final move, with all their power, the brothers blast the asteroid until it's destroyed, leaving behind 2 metal spheres and reverting the effects of the Enhancer. With the chaos done for the moment, the X-Men take time to reflect on the road ahead, leaving with a word from Charles himself.
We will be there to help you along the way. All of us. Together. Unified. Because we are the X-Men.
Okay, I'm really hoping this goes well because I'm recording the audio in a different way with an app that specifically only records the audio. For those of you who don't know, I usually record audio with my camera 2 angle, but it's actually visually recording too. You just don't see that unless it's a reaction because I do both angles. But this will save a lot of space in the memory for this process and future processes where I just decide to not switch between angles. Also, I want to give a quick shout out and thank you to Michael, who made me feel so good. I teared up from this comment. It made my day start so wonderful. He's such a great supporter. If you see him in the comments, please show him some love. If you're watching this in the mainline premiere, thank you. If you're watching this on Patreon, thank you. And let's get started with season 2. With the first arc complete and still several mysteries remaining, we enter season 2, not with a fizzle, but with a bang.
Uh-oh. Bad vibe.
New looks, new students, and new problems arising left and right make this season filled with some of the best episodes in the series. And in my opinion, and apparently in the opinion of the staff, I watched a behind the scenes video that's here on YouTube. I'll link it below. It's really nice, especially if you like this series. Check it out. It's like an hour and a half long. They only talk about seasons 1 through 3 and a little bit about season 4, and it gets progressively less in depth as it goes on. And I remember viewing this as a kid. I think it's because I had the DVDs that they talk about, but it could have been something else, but I'm pretty sure it's because I had the DVDs and I watched everything on it, so I saw behind the scenes footage. So that was just really refreshing for me, or enlightening. I'm not sure what to call that. But the creative team behind X-Men Evolution also felt like when they got to season 2 is really when they got their momentum and end road, like really knew what they were doing. And you can tell by just experiencing the show. It's, in my opinion, the best season. It's kind of my favorite season. It's the longest season. I think it's worth noting too. There's just a lot to unpack here, so let's just go ahead and get started. Season 2, episode 1 is titled Growing Pains. Without proper authority to keep the Brotherhood in check, since Magneto and Mystique are missing, they decide it's time for mutants to reveal their existence to the world during a soccer game being live broadcasted. This episode is when we're also introduced to Risty, who I thought was named Misty my whole life until doing this retrospective and watching the show with subtitles twice and seeing, I was like, is that a mistake? Because there's a few mistakes. And I was like, is that? No, her name was Risty, and I thought it was Misty because I thought it was like Mystique being petty. You know, she's like, I'm Mystique, so I'll say my name is Misty. I thought it was petty. Risty is Mystique disguised as a new student since she's been exposed as Principal Darkholm, at least to the X-Men, which is pretty significant still. During the soccer game, Lance takes it upon himself to announce their existence, exposing the X-Men, and of course, a fight ensues.
I'll give you pleasure.
I'm about to feel really big and stupid, if you know what I mean.
During the chaos, Charles telepathically summons Storm to put a downpour, which settles the heat of the moment. In a very interesting way, it seems like rain could do that in the middle of a fight, especially a downpour. The The X-Men are forced to publicly use their powers and protect the bystanders from the Brotherhood's shenanigans. With no other choice, Charles decides to wipe the memory of everyone who witnessed the event. It's not clear if Charles also wiped the memories of the Brotherhood, but I'd say this is another example of questionable telepathic ethics. I understand that it was to keep mutants a secret from the public eye, especially after being exposed in such a horrifying way, but I'm still calling this a gray area for telepathic ethics. Charles ultimately succeeds, but strains himself when it comes to mind-wiping Principal Kelly, leaving himself and us unsure if he was able to finish the job. It begs the question, why didn't Charles check later when he wasn't fatigued? Like the next day or a week later, even a month later or something, and just made sure that the job was done. Small plot hole. Perhaps, if you know the answer, comment it below, but I just thought I'd point that out. Later, we find out a magnetic pulse interfered with the newscast, basically confirming that Magneto not only survived, but is keeping an eye on things.
My only concern is Principal Kelly. I was inside his mind when I blacked out, and I'm not sure I finished the job.
Episode 2 is titled Power Surge, and this is one of my favorite episodes in the series. This season really heightens the drama, and this episode continues that trend. We start off with, oh wait, no, this isn't one of my favorite seasons. Wait, did I say Power Surge? Okay, my mistake. This episode is not titled Power Surge. Is that what it says on the wiki? Yeah, that's what it says on the wiki. That's why I got them mixed up, because I don't have them in my notes. I just figured I'd use the wiki. Episode 2 is actually Bada Bing Bada Boom. And this is not one of my favorite episodes, but it's still a very good one. Power Surge is one of my favorite episodes. But let's talk about Tabitha's introductory episode. We start off with the training simulation for the new recruits, and this is when we're introduced to Tabitha Smith, codenamed Boom Boom. And appropriate. It's kind of dumb, and so is she.
Oh yeah? Well, hang on to your blue tail, yonder boy.
During her wild antics, Kirk gets injured and the two are punished proper. We're then introduced to Tabitha's father, who after finding her reveals that he wants to use her powers to rob a carnival vault. I think it's specifically a fundraiser. During this, the two are confronted by the X-Men, minus Rogue. And I like to point this out because I feel like that's signified subtly that she was getting distracted by her friendship with Risty, something that I think Mystique intended to do. Risty really embodies the perfect friend for Rogue, being very close but not too close, understanding her, and being even visually appealing to Rogue's aesthetic. It's interesting the route Mystique went to get close to her. Tabitha's father ends up getting away with the money, leading to a heartbreaking scene, and I mean heartbreaking, where Tabitha begs her father to leave the money and go back with her to safety.
Stop and forget the money! Grab my hand, please! Daddy!
Unfortunately, he ends up choosing the money and collapses through the floor, ends up being caught, and that's the end of him. And after experiencing this series of traumatic events, Tabitha ends up leaving the X-Men and joining the Brotherhood.
Hey there. Not bad. So, stay out of my room.
Now we have one of my favorite episodes in the series. Episode 3, Power Surge. This episode truly began to solidify that Jean and Scott are more than just skinny love on a surface level. They are soulmates.
I know you better than anyone ever has, or ever will. Come on, you can do this.
Scott?
In the beginning, Jean is voted MVP for the soccer team and she's giving a speech. During this time, unfortunately, her telepathy goes out of control, temporarily causing her to freak out. They explain this as her mutation accelerating at a rate that's too fast for her to control, and that's why she can't block out thoughts, and it's something that happens a lot with Jean Grey. And in the comics, when this happens, the professor usually puts psychic blocks in her mind to allow the power to slowly unleash itself at a pace where she is able to control it. The problems rapidly escalate, first hurling Scott off a ledge at Duncan's party.
Jean?
Then putting several people in fatal danger when her telekinesis loses control during a track practice. I believe this is when we're also introduced to Hank, and there's a nice moment between him and Scott where he notices Scott get tackled by Duncan during a race and helps him out by giving him back his glasses, and it just kind of foreshadows he's going to be involved with the students of the Institute. There's another nice moment between Lance and Kitty when he notices a spear launched at her and the other girls lining up for a race, hurling at them that Jean launched. Not on purpose, it was her telekinesis, and he uses his power to make them all trip forward and avoid danger. Lance's relationship with Kitty leans hard into the romantic aspect from this point forward. She's even got him going to school again. So often, it seems like Lance doesn't really want to be a bad guy. He just seems like he's been a victim of an unfortunate scenario and that he really does want something better for himself. Moments like this show that. I think he's just in the wrong crowd. So now we're at a point where Jean's powers are evolving so fast she just cannot control them.
Jean! Wait!
As I said earlier, I believe this suggests that the professor may have put psychic blocks in her mind from this point forward, because we do see a drastic increase in her actually her powers in general. This is never stated, it's just my assumption. When things are looking extremely bleak, Rogue suggests using her power to drain some of the intensity off of Jean into herself in hopes of calming her down. She's literally spiraling out of control, caught in the middle of a swirling vortex of telekinetic energy. With no other options, the team accepts this and they move forward. After Rogue makes contact,
her telekinesis seems to be rearranging matter on a molecular level. I fear we haven't much time.
Clock's running. Let's move!
Her power in combination with Jean's allows Jean to telepathically speak to Scott through Rogue and calmly in her swirl of telekinetic madness. This allows Scott to get through to Jean and save her. At the end, Scott questions why Rogue was willing to risk so much to save her, and Rogue sheds some light on the situation.
Me and Miss Popularity there, we're worlds apart. Galaxies. But then I realized something, that she'd do the same thing for me.
It really demonstrates how together the X-Men are. No matter how different, no matter what they're going through, they really are a family, and all they really have is each other, through thick and thin. And this really showed that through Rogue and Jean, who are probably the most different people on the team.
Believe it, Rogue. We all would.
Episode 4 is titled Fun and Games. Another one of my favorite episodes. Charles calls his first generation students together and informs them that he must take a trip to reassure that Juggernaut is not able to escape. With Ororo away and Logan somewhere out on the road, Charles is left with no other option but to leave Scott and Jean in charge.
Scott, Jean, I'm placing you both in charge. Can I count on you?
Without a doubt, Professor.
It doesn't take long for the other students to plan a party behind Scott and Jean's backs, and soon after we are introduced to a very unique one-off character, Arcade. I think I'd say the most fascinating one-off character that doesn't have a mutation. Not the most fascinating human character, I'd say that's Amanda, at least right now. That might change later in the deep dive, but yeah. Arcade is pretty interesting, and he's interesting in the comics too. You should check him out. Mystique basically orchestrates this whole event so she can get access to Cerebro. Arcade gaining access to the mansion's security system and initiating DEFCON 4 was more of an afterthought. We witness Arcade and the X-Men play a game of cat and mouse that is literally so much fun. He's basically playing a game with them, operating the dangerous tools of the Danger Room to move them through certain locations, and they have to use their powers to navigate through the underground basement to get to him, to stop him. It's so much fun. In the end, Arcade is convinced that the whole experience was just a game, so there was no need to wipe his mind, which they are so ready to do in this series, and they allow him to go home, and that's where we leave the episode.
Someone who orchestrated all of this, including my trip away.
So now it's up to us to find out who it was.
And what they were after.
Episode 5 is titled The Beast of Bayville. If you couldn't tell from the title, it's time for Hank McCoy, better known as Beast, to join the X-Men.
I've lost him!
Evan gets caught ditching Hank's class, which ultimately leads them to developing a bond that's never referred to again. Evan does go on a trip with Hank's students in a later episode, so maybe that's why he was included in that, because I always thought it was weird for Evan to be included in that trip, other than the fact that he visually fit the point. Spyke get the point. Oh gosh. But perhaps that's why. They may like to do subtle connections more so, like with Jean's communicator, and allow you to come to conclusions yourself. Or these are forgotten plot points that they never decided to elaborate on. Either way, it's still really fun. It's also worth noting that they're placed on the same team during the final event, so maybe their bond is hinted at more than I initially thought. Hank begins to lose control of the beast within him, and as a scientist tries to remedy the solution like a scientist would. And through the formulas that he concocted, ended up morphing his outer appearance to match the appearance of the beast he felt within. After a chase that takes the X-Men all over Bayville.
On our way.
Hank is finally pinned down by Jean's telekinesis and saved. He ends up refusing an image inducer, unsure of his ability to control the beast within still, but ultimately decides to join the X-Men as its newest instructor.
Welcome, Mr. McCoy.
Thank you. But from here on in, I'm not just Mr. McCoy. You can call me Beast.
This was a brilliant way to get a new instructor that's a mutant to the Institute, because Hank was already a teacher at Bayville, and it's something that it seems like he would want to continue to do, and he's able to do now for the newest generation and the ones still young enough to be taught by him. Episode 6 is titled Adrift.
Look!
With the roster continuing to grow strong, we find Scott and Alex getting extreme footage during a treacherous storm. This episode is surprisingly mature. It's been established that Alex lives in Hawaii and the X-Men live in Massachusetts. When Scott goes to visit his brother, the two become adrift and desperately use their powers in unique ways to survive until the X-Men are able to save them. Barely reunited, and the brothers once again faced tragedy. When things were looking their worst, Alex even says a potential goodbye. Alex doesn't get much screen time, but when he does, it's very memorable.
Look! The X-Jet! Jean! I cannot hold it back for long!
Hang on! They're in! Go, go, go!
Episode 7 is titled African Storm. Somewhere in the heart of Africa, a tribe is seen performing a ritual related to Storm. We learn that this is the tribe that she belonged to that worshipped her after her mutation manifested. The Hangan. Oh, I thought that was like a cool name. He seeks revenge on Storm after being replaced by her. During this time, this coincides with Evan's bad behavior reaching peak levels, leading Ororo and Charles to decide to send Evan home. Ororo becomes haunted by unfortunate events, the worst of which triggers her claustrophobia, and ultimately leads to her getting kidnapped. The X-Men battle Hangan's forces, easily taking them down, before facing Ororo under his control. Evan ends up saving her by utilizing what she taught him earlier in the episode.
I'm in your hands, Evan.
Usiku!
You're toast, dude.
No!
This episode had a plethora of wonderful designs. Storm as she appeared when she worshipped Africa, all of the tribe's designs, Africa in general. I always thought it looked so cool how Kitty phased through one of the Hungan's forces' whip. It like unravels itself around her torso, and the way she phases through it just, I don't know, it seems very complex. It's like in layers. It was a cool scene to see visually as a kid and still to this day. And the way Ororo's spirit returned to her body, that was visually stunning and a bit jarring. Easily my favorite episode featuring Evan and Ororo so far.
The next day.
Hello, I took a quick intermission. There's so much noise happening just around me that I had to just wait until that wasn't happening, I guess, and that's no longer happening. I'm also holding my mic now because I don't know, I just kind of want to try this out. This is my mic, by the way. It's usually clipped onto the top of my laptop just to have it as close as possible without me holding it. But for a little bit, we're going to hold on to this and just see how that takes the audio. I'm also going to apologize because I hear the air on. You might hear that in the background a little bit, but I'm going to do my best to make sure that does not exist. Let's continue. Episode 8 is titled Joyride. This season, we've steadily seen Lance and Kitty get closer, and this episode puts that in the spotlight. At this point, we find Lance at the mansion ready to join the X-Men in order to get closer to Kitty, but any reason's, I guess, a pretty good reason to join the good team.
Something we can do for you, bub?
Yeah, I've come to join the X-Men.
Side note, I don't know if I mentioned this specifically, but Kerr at the beginning of the season, when he got in trouble for breaking his curfew with Tabitha, got his punishment extended, and that's still being touched upon to this episode, where it will eventually be relieved, and you will see when we get to that point. But I just thought that was a nice detail to have that be so consistent halfway through this season. During a training session with Scott and Logan, I know Scott's at least there, Bobby and Amara begin showing potential as candidates for X-Men.
Okay.
Lance begins training with the team, much to the dismay of Scott, and this leads to multiple challenges that the students must complete, showing off their unique abilities. After Bobby, Jubilee, Multiple, and Berserker, I believe, trash a couple cars and it's noticed by Scott and Logan, Lance ends up getting blamed for the incident since he came from the Brotherhood. Spearheaded by Scott, seeking a bigger thrill than they already had, Bobby and the crew end up hijacking the X-Jet, forcing Lance and Kitty to hop on board to stop them.
Lance, what are you?
Start phasing!
They get chased by government planes who launch heat missiles at them, and cleverly, Jubilee uses her power to generate a firework to divert the heat missiles' effects into it instead of their jet. Eventually, the crew is in a free fall, and Bobby uses his power to create a ramp that strategically uses their momentum to launch them back into trajectory to get enough momentum to start the jet again. Showing potential. Lance even creates a rock slide to veer the jets off course when they're flying down a ravine. They ultimately lose the government planes by Kitty phasing the X-Jet through a mesa, showing how far her powers have tremendously progressed. In the end, even when Lance's name is cleared, he ends up leaving the team to join the Brotherhood, but not before Kitty leaves him with a kiss, and still a little bit of hope that one day he'll change his mind and join her with the X-Men. A truly adorable scene that locked this couple in the ship tank. Lance's character journey, especially his heroic journey, reminds me a lot of Jinx from another show that I would love to cover in this format. Comment below if you want that. Episode 9 is titled On Angel Wings. Warren Worthington III, better known as one of the 5 original X-Men, Angel makes his debut to X-Men Evolution. This is the closest episode to a holiday special the series has to offer. With the majority of the students visiting home for the holidays, and those with nowhere to go, like Hank, Logan, Scott, and Rogue, still at the mansion, the holiday begins. Civilians spot Warren in public and think that he's a literal angel. But Charles, knowing he's a mutant, sends Rogue and Scott to investigate. Or I should say Rogue persuades Charles to send them to investigate. She really shoots her shot in this episode. She's trying to get it in with Scott. She's like, Jean's not here? Okay.
Just us, the prof, Mr. McCoy.
I mean, we can't touch Scott, but you know, we could talk. It's an interesting thing to think about. Like, would she need another mutant to shut off her ability, like when she wants to have kids? Would they need to do it for 9 months? Does she have potential to ever fully control her ability? Is that the goal? Perhaps. Rogue is fascinating. Her power is so interesting. Magneto, also taking an interest in Angel, attempts to sway him to his side and ultimately fails. Warren, Scott, and Rogue successfully fend off Magneto, and we get a very cool scene where Rogue touches him and gets his powers. and offer him a place at the Institute, and ultimately he declines. Another interesting refusal, I thought. Havoc, or I should say Alex, Scott's brother, I was so sure when I was a kid was going to join the Institute and did not, and neither did Angel. But Beast did, and it almost made you think at this point, like, who's actually going to accept the invitation, since not everyone is inclined to, even if they don't necessarily want to be on Magneto or Mystique's side. Not the greatest episode in my opinion, but it was still very fun, especially since we got to see Angel get highlighted. And that's something I want to know too, like if she touches Angel, will she get wings? She does in the comics, but does she in Evolution?
I think you really are an angel.
Episode 10 is titled Mindbender. We're a little over halfway through the season and the major story arc begins to thicken. Mesmero takes control over Jean's mind, being an extremely powerful telepath himself, and she ends up missing.
Hey, Duncan, is Jean over there? Have you heard from her at all? All right, thanks. No, nothing to worry about. Bye.
The X-Men scatter the city looking for her. Evan checks the police station. Rogue checks a music store. I don't really know. I think they sold CDs. Do stores even do that anymore? But it was a specific store that sold music that we got to see them party in at the Bayville Sirens episode. And just all around town, even Kitty goes to the Brotherhood, just asking where she was, knowing that Blob has taken initiative to kidnap her before.
I never said you guys kidnapped her. Sheesh. As if one of you had tried it before.
But she was legitimately just checking to see if they happened to see her. After failing to catch up with Jean, Evan, Kurt, and Kitty eventually fall under the same hypnosis as her. In my opinion, this seems to foreshadow the events in the finale with the 4 Horsemen of Apocalypse. The hypnotized team succeeds in stealing several rings with increasing difficulty and security guards before being confronted by the X-Men, Hank, Rogue, Scott, Logan, and the Professor.
Come on, Kurt! Don't fight me! Look out!
Would you knock that off?
Charles faces Mesmero in telepathic combat, a very cool scene, and ultimately beats him, but is overpowered when he senses the immense might of Apocalypse. Mesmero ends up getting what he wants and releases his hold of the students, taking the next steps closer to his ultimate goal, freeing the first mutant ever.
Apocalypse.
Episode 11 is titled Shadow Dance, another personal favorite. Forge returns to experiment with Kurt's powers, while the other students prepare for a school dance. Here we get to see several romantic and platonic relationships flourish. Something I like to point out is I initially thought this was the Sadie Hawkins dance because all the girls were taking the initiative to ask the guys.
Would you go with me?
Who, me? Yeah, sure. Okay.
It wasn't the Sadie Hawkins dance because that comes up later and quite soon. So I thought this was super interesting that this show was progressive in that way, where it's not the guys have to ask the girls, which I hope is super dead by now because it was basically dead when I was in high school, and we get to see the girls take initiative and ask the guys on dates. Jean planned on asking Scott, but Taryn gets in there first and ends up going with Scott, forcing Jean to go with Duncan. Rogue secretly wants to go with Scott but settles for her fake friend Risty, while Kitty adorably asks Lance.
Lance, would you would you go to the dance with me?
This episode is when we're also introduced to Amanda, the best human character in the series.
Awesome.
Forge creates a device that slows down, I believe, Nightcrawler's teleportation, allowing him to pass through the pocket dimension at a slower pace so they can gather information. Upon a second visit, Kurt and Logan are attacked by the local creatures. These trips have been leaving rifts in the dimensions that allow these creatures to pass from their dimension into the X-Men's. And since this happens to be where Kurt was porting, he ended up porting to the school dance, and where do you think the creature showed up?
Come on, let's get out of here!
Luckily, the X-Men and the Brotherhood are able to fend them off successfully and secretly until Forge sends them back to where they came from with the device that he was introduced with, but modified to send them back to where they came from instead of the pocket dimension of basically purgatory. We end with Kurt revealing his true form to Amanda, who accepts him with open, loving arms, becoming the best human character in the show, and ending this episode on a fantastic note. One of the best in the series.
You won't like what you see up close.
Let me decide that.
Well...
Did you know that blue is my favorite color?
Episode 12 is titled Retreat. This episode is particularly special to me. I know I've said that a few times at least, but I remember watching this often as a kid over and over again because it highlighted a few new characters alongside Kitty and Evan. Those new characters being Sunspot, Wolfsbane, who I don't think we get to see very much after this at all. We do see her like in a few minor instances, but nothing as notable as her she-wolf form in this. And Bobby, of course. Hank begins to realize that he needs to sync with the beast inside instead of fight it, or maybe suppress it would be more accurate, and ends up taking the students on a field trip into the forest thanks to the help and suggestion of Kitty, who needs the trip for a school project and intuitively understands that Hank could use the trip to let himself be himself. She has quite a way of taming the more aggressive feral men specifically in the series. So as I said earlier, the group consists of Beast, Kitty, Evan, Sunspot, Bobby, and Wolfsbane. I don't know Sunspot and Wolfsbane's real names right off the top of my head right now. And what I find interesting about this combination of people is nearly everyone's mutation alters their physical appearance, with the exception of Kitty, but I kind of count hers because hers is so visual and connected to her body. It seems fitting. Her power is also used as a visual gag to freak people out in this series, so I think that plays into the physical aspect of the mutation taking an effect on the person. I'd also like to point out how amazing the OST is, especially when they're rescuing Hank in the flood.
Come on, give me some sun! Now we're talking!
The series OST is fire. You should check it out just for that, for all these reasons, but that's fantastic alone. I mean, the opening, still a banger. Hank gets captured by a group searching for Bigfoot, which I find hilarious because he kind of is Bigfoot. He's Sasquatch, if anyone, late to the game, but he does fit the mold for the most part. A flash flood ends up freeing Hank, but he ends up needing to be saved by the students who save him and the hunters. In the end, Hank finds a new piece about his mutation and the new path that he's on because of the way his mutation has altered his life. And he's happy with that, and the students return home.
Yo, here's the word. Bigfoot's our friend. Get the point?
Looking for something?
Episode 13 is probably my second favorite episode in the entire series, titled A Walk on the Wild Side. And it's also the first reaction you can find on the channel. Like I said earlier, Mutant Crush was the first thing I ever did. But if you go back to the beginning, this is the oldest thing that you will find next to a trailer, which I don't really count because it's just a trailer. So if you want to check that out, it's very cringy, but go ahead. And we're still gonna gush about it in this. It's such a good episode. Normally, I'm not for the girl power episode because it does more harm than good, in my opinion. I state in that video why I think that, but to give you a brief synopsis, I just believe that you should incorporate all genders as equally as necessary for the story to progress, and that should be apparent enough to not feel the necessity of the girl power episode. However, there is a lot of fun to be had with this trope, whatever you want to call it, and I feel like X-Men Evolution handled this extremely maturely because the men in this series, especially the younger men like Scott, have had a bit of a viewpoint on the women. So strange to me that that has happened with the X-Men because the women, especially in Evolution, are just so outstandingly powerful, but I digress. Their commentary on the fact that they are treated differently just based on their gender in the girl power episode just seems extremely fitting and helped balance the necessity of the episode. A quick side note, this is when we know the Sadie Hawkins dance is happening because Duncan has a bit of a moment where he buys the Sadie Hawkins dance tickets for Jean.
I got us tickets for the Sadie Hawkins dance next month.
Excuse me, Duncan, but aren't girls supposed to ask guys to that dance?
Well...
You know, I just don't know what I'd do if I didn't have you guys around to make my decisions for me.
Even though they're a couple, and I kind of understand that you would assume, but still, in that specific scenario, for that specific dance, the girls were specifically supposed to ask the men. I digress. And another thing I would like to point out about the reason why the girl power episode in this series feels organic and welcome as opposed to a lot of other patronizing versions of it is because the leading cast is gender split equally. There's 3 men and 3 women, which is something you rarely see in superhero teams and in shows in general still to this day. And on top of that, the females, everyone in this cast gets their own unique personality and storylines that aren't inherently connected to anyone's gender, which I feel is important and was very ahead of its time. We begin the episode with Scott showing his more sexist side.
That's a good thing for you girls I was here. No need for thanks. That's what we heroes do. Rescue damsels in distress. What?
By saving Amara and Jean during a training exercise that she did not need any help with. And then adding onto it with a few unnecessary comments. This leads to Amara, Tabitha, and Jean indirectly teaming up and continuing that team to form the Bayville Sirens after adding Shadowcat and Rogue as their newest members. Being dubbed by the media the Bayville Sirens, they have a moment where they strut down the school halls in slow motion, playing homage to the forever iconic movie The Craft. Something that I knew since I was a kid because I was watching it as much as I watched this show over and over. I was like, this is the exact same thing in The Craft. Like, the kiss. I was like, even Amara is in the black girl's place. It didn't even feel petty to me. I thought it was weird that Kitty threw the kiss. I thought that Rogue should have done that. If anyone should have been standing in Nancy's place, it should have been Rogue. But whatever, it's still fantastic overall that they even decided to do that, and not many people noticed this. The 5 girls get whole new badass looks for this episode and end up fighting crime at night unbeknownst to their team members. Tabitha is the only person to bring this look back, and it is such a shame because all the girls look so good clad in leather and black. Scott and Kurt end up pursuing the girls one night, and during the chase, Kitty ends up facing the car through a train. A visually stunning animation to see, especially the headlights as they narrowed down when the car got closer. A beautiful touch. The girls are ultimately caught and disbanded by the police, not knowing that it was actually Mystique in disguise, and stopped being the Bayville Sirens. And I believe Mystique did this because in her secret agenda, she wants Rogue to be less involved with the X-Men and more involved with her, not only so she can get information, which we see her do several times in this series, but that's just one less opponent that they have to worry about, her Brotherhood or whatever. And I kind of think she was frustrated that she wasn't invited to the party.
To someday.
Episode 14 is titled Operation Rebirth, and this one is very special. It's not one of my particular favorites, but it is a special episode regardless, I can say that. Rarely does this show branch out into the wider world of Marvel. It did it once very minorly in the comics, and this is the only other instance I believe we have of it other than like S.H.I.E.L.D. S.H.I.E.L.D. doesn't count though. We quickly find out that Wolverine not only participated in World War II, but served next to Captain America. And during this time saved Magneto as a child as well. Elsewhere at the school, we get another instance of gray telepathic influence, and this time it's from Jean. Kurt and Rogue get harassed by a bully, and this leads to Kurt's true form being revealed, and Jean makes the student forget that.
You're going to forget. You don't remember any of this. You're going to leave now.
Which I understand why she did. I understand, but who would have believed him, you know? Like, if he went and told everyone that, who would have believed him? Why would it have mattered? Did she need to do that? I don't think she needed to do that. but she did. Feels invasive. Logan, Kurt, and Ro go on a mission to the Sahara Desert to destroy the machine that gave Captain America power, but not specifically for that. I believe they're destroying it so no one else can use it, because it ended up being a detriment to the Captain America of this universe. Despite Captain America experiencing adverse effects from the machine, Magneto claimed that for mutants, it did the opposite and enhanced their lifespan. Magneto convinces Kurt not to destroy the device long enough for him to undergo the procedure, but in the end, it is destroyed by Wolverine so no one could use it in the future. They never show Magneto in hand-to-hand combat after this, but it would have been nice to see how the enhancer affected that. After being spared by Kurt and remembering Logan from his childhood, he allows the trio to escape, and that concludes the episode. Another one that's not one of my favorites, but I see why it could be so special to people, especially if you're just a huge fan of the wider Marvel world and like that it was referenced at all, or if you're a fan of Captain America and X-Men. That makes this situation extremely cool, so I see the potential of the cool factor. Episode 15 is titled The Hex Factor.
Bad vibe.
Prepare to meet the gothic version of the Scarlet Witch. Being held captive in a mental institution, I believe, Wanda ends up escaping from her shackles enough to cause copious amounts of damage to the facility and ultimately ends up running into the professor. With his powers, he's able to suppress her long enough for the guards to handle her. We quickly find out that this was a plan formulated by Mystique to help Wanda escape. And immediately after helping Wanda escape, Mystique goes back in disguised as a security guard to take care of some unfinished business. Put a pin in that. Also, let's just take a moment to appreciate Mystique's new look, because this is my favorite look the character has ever had. I love the two-piece. The black two-piece is so fire. I love the sleekness of her design. The yellow eyes, the red hair. She looks so good. You may notice Risty suddenly disappears from this point onward, after being in nearly every episode, even if it was just a little. In my opinion, this is basically part 1 of the finale. Wanda is reunited with her brother Pietro and instantly lashes out and demonstrates her ability to throw mutants' powers back at them. During a confrontation at the mall, the X-Men effortlessly defeat the Brotherhood in embarrassing fashion, but are no match for Wanda. Not even close. She even gets her own bad entrance theme song. I love this interpretation of Wanda. Her powers are never fully defined, but she's clearly powerful. And despite entering later in the series, she gets some of the most interesting storylines and depth in the cast.
You know, handling defeat is as much a mark of your character as coming home the victor. And from what I see, this was a lesson apparently much needed.
Season 2 finale, Day of Reckoning parts 1 and 2. After doing everything in their power to make sure mutant kind remains hidden from the public, the X-Men's worst nightmare begins to see fruition. Things get ramped up to 1,000 in this 2-part finale. We find out pretty quickly that Mystique is disguised as the professor, but it's nice to notice the breadcrumbs they left behind. Having Jean use Cerebro for such an important matter, she's trying to locate Wolverine, who was just kidnapped. By the way, that happens at the beginning of the episode. It's such an important thing. I couldn't understand, even as a child, why Charles had Jean do that instead of himself. The X-Men are taken through their most intense training sequence we've seen so far.
We're gonna rush him.
And in the professor's disappointment, he forces the X-Men to team up with the Brotherhood. Scott quits the team because of this, and the X-Men are forced to face Magneto without him. Elsewhere, Wolverine's been captured by S.H.I.E.L.D. and learns about the Sentinel program. Meanwhile, Mystique activates DEFCON 4 at the Institute. You may remember DEFCON 4 from Fun and Games, and if you're just an X-Men fan, you know how detrimental Sentinels are to the X-Men's survival. It's always been a factor ever since its inception, and it will probably always be as long as the X-Men exist. When she activated DEFCON 4, Mystique also set the Institute to explode. So not only is it locked down, but there's no way out for the students. She really was trying to end it all. Was her plan to actually eliminate all the students? Because what if she succeeded? What if Scott didn't go back and give them proper leadership? How would she have known that? She could not have expected him to quit. She may have thought he would, but there's no way she could have predicted the events of him saving the students. So I believe she really intended to end them. Amara ended up escaping and finds Tabitha, who was forced to leave the Brotherhood after Mystique returned. They end up finding Scott to warn him about the institute that's gone under lockdown, and when they all return, find the students just in time to get them into Cerebro so they can survive the blast. Elsewhere, the X-Men and the Brotherhood face Magneto and his acolytes? Acolytes. I don't know how to say that word, but Magneto and his squad. Acolytes. I'm gonna say acolytes, and if it's wrong, I'm sorry. But they stop to fight Magneto and his acolytes. This is also when the studly Colossus makes his debut, and the ever so suave and sexy Gambit also makes his debut. Pyro also makes his debut, but who cares? Sabretooth is the fourth acolyte. Very fitting. Having Gambit and Colossus as acolytes always felt so fascinating to me, even as a kid. And when I was watching behind the scenes commentary, this was intentional on their part because they wanted to shake up the image of Magneto's squad and some of the X-Men you're used to seeing. Because Gambit does have a bit of a shady past. He's done some very awful things against mutant kind in general, and he was also a thief, so him doing something a bit shady in X-Men Evolution is ever so fitting. And Colossus, it's just kind of fun to see him on Magneto's side. It was interesting to me because of the metal effect. Like, I always thought, like, why doesn't Magneto just like hold Wolverine next to him and say, do whatever I want all the time? Like, it doesn't seem like it would even take much effort. We do eventually find out that Colossus is working for Magneto because he's being blackmailed, which seems fitting because he is just so altruistic, and they do let his altruistic nature shine a bit in the show, and I thought that was so fun. Magneto's plan ends up being revealing mutants' existence to mankind, and in this moment, a Sentinel is unleashed on the Brotherhood and X-Men, forced to either flee or team up to defeat the Sentinel, as the incident is broadcast to the entire world. Many are captured, but most escape, retreating to the Institute only to find it destroyed. Quickly, they discover that the students survived thanks to Scott, but in a tunnel vision of rage, Scott pushes Jean to the side, grabs the professor, and hurls him to the ground. This is when Mystique decides to reveal her true identity to the group and reveals that things are about to get much worse. Mutants have been revealed to the public. Several of their teammates and instructors are captured. Charles is missing. And with their sanctuary, the Institute, destroyed, they have nowhere to live. Over an hour and a half later, and we're not even on season 3, but we are over halfway through the series because season 2 is the longest. I've decided to make this a 2-part event. Part 2 is being currently worked on. It'll be out as fast as possible. I just wanted to say thank you for watching. I hope you've learned something. I hope you come back for part 2 to learn even more. And I want to take the opportunity to say thank you to my patrons who have been so dedicated and helped me continue to do this YouTube journey. Without them, I would not be able to do this, and I could always use more support. So if you would like to be a patron, the link is in the description box down below. You get features early and a lot of other stuff. I usually do reactions, so the deep dive is a little different, but I am going to be doing more of those. And as each piece of the deep dives are complete, they are put on Patreon. So that's the perk you can look forward to the most over there. And I just want to thank everyone for watching up to this point. If you want to help me in a non-monetary aspect, hitting the like button, commenting, sharing, and just watching all help tremendously. Oh, and of course, subscribing. Subscribe to see more, and I will be working on part 2. That'll be coming out very, very soon. And I hope to see you for the next one. Check out some of my reactions until then, and I hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful new year, and part 2 is coming soon. I love you, and thank you for watching.